The first time I realized I was about to become the villain in someone else's story, I was sitting in my truck outside a strip mall Starbucks at 6:17 a.m. Watching my wife's location stay perfectly still at an address that was not ours, while the sky over Raleigh was still that ugly pre-sunrise gray and my hands kept slipping on the steering wheel because I couldn't stop sweating. Even though it was December and my breath was fogging the glass like I was some teenager hiding from his parents instead of a 38-year-old man trying to convince himself that a decade of marriage didn't just evaporate overnight. I remember thinking, in this weird detached way, that if I walked in there and I was wrong, I'd be the kind of paranoid husband people warned their friends about, and if I walked in there and I was right, I'd never be able to unsee it, and either way I'd be dragging my whole life across a line I couldn't step back over. Because you can't unknow the thing that finally breaks you. My wife Erin and I weren't some picture-perfect Instagram couple, but we were the kind of steady that felt like it would last, the kind you build when you've paid bills together, painted a nursery together, survived 2 job changes and 1 near-miss foreclosure scare when my hospital IT department got reorganized and my salary got temporarily adjusted, in a way that made my stomach feel like it was eating itself. We met in college at UNC Greensboro, back when Erin wore her hair in this messy bun and pretended she didn't care about what people thought, even though she absolutely cared, and it was part of what I loved about her, because she was always trying to be better, always trying to make the world around her prettier, and I'm not built like that at all, because I'm the guy who thinks a room is fine as long as the Wi-Fi works and the couch doesn't collapse. A lot of our social life, especially after we moved to Raleigh for my job at the hospital, orbited around Matt, who was my childhood best friend from back in Indiana before my family moved south, and who had become the brother I chose rather than the one I was born with, the guy I used to ride bikes with until the streetlights came on, the guy who stood next to me at my wedding in a rented suit that didn't quite fit his shoulders and promised me, with a beer in his hand and tears in his eyes. That Erin was the best thing that ever happened to me. Matt had been dating Chloe for about a year, and Chloe was one of those people who seemed like she had 1,000 tabs open in her brain at all times, always catching details, always remembering what you said last month, always noticing the small stuff like whether you sounded tired or whether your smile was real, and I liked her instantly because she didn't play the whole cool girlfriend thing, she just showed up as herself, loud laugh, blunt honesty, and a kind of loyalty that made you feel safe around her. For years, our routine was simple and kind of boring in a way that felt comforting, which is the part people don't appreciate until it's gone, because boring can mean stable, and stable can mean you're building something, and I thought we were building something. Thursday nights were usually dinner with Matt and Chloe, Sundays were meal prep and laundry and the kind of errands that make you feel like an adult even if you hate every second of them. And Erin and I had our own rituals like splitting a Diet Coke at the movies because she swore it tasted better that way, or arguing about whether the thermostat should be on 68 or 72 like it was a moral issue rather than a preference. Then, around late summer, little things started to tilt, not dramatic things, not caught her with lipstick on her collar things, but the slow creep of distance that makes you question whether you're imagining it or whether you're the only one noticing the air getting colder, because Erin began guarding her phone like it contained state secrets, and her laugh became more private. Like she was laughing with someone who wasn't me even when she was sitting next to me on the couch. She started dressing nicer for work in a way that didn't match her usual vibe, and I don't mean she looked bad before, because Erin always looked good, but there's a difference between I'm going to work and I'm going to be seen, and she started choosing outfits that felt like she was auditioning for someone's attention, and when I'd say something mild like, "You look amazing," she would smile without looking at me, like my compliment was background noise. The first time my gut really spoke up was a Friday night when Matt came over without Chloe, which was unusual, and Erin was in the kitchen, cleaning even though the counters were already clean, and Matt's eyes kept flicking to Erin like he couldn't decide whether to look at her or avoid her, and when I asked where Chloe was, Matt gave me this weird half shrug and said she was tired, in a tone that didn't match tiredness. And Erin dropped a fork into the sink so hard it clanged like a warning bell. I told myself I was reading into it because work had been brutal, and I'd been sleeping like garbage, and my brain was primed to see problems, but the truth is that when you've known someone your whole life, you notice when their energy shifts around your spouse, and Matt's energy around Erin felt like guilt trying to stand still. I didn't hire a private investigator, I didn't do some cinematic hack into her emails, and I didn't have some friend whisper, "You need to check her," because honestly I didn't want to be that guy, and I kept telling myself that trust is either real or it's not, and if you have to police your spouse, you've already lost something. What broke it open was something stupid and modern and humiliating, because Erin and I shared locations on our phones mostly for convenience, like the way couples do when they're coordinating groceries or making sure the other person got home safe, and I almost never checked it, not because I was noble but because it felt invasive and unnecessary, and I didn't want to be the husband staring at a map like a prison guard. That morning, the day I ended up in my truck outside the Starbucks, I checked it because Erin had texted me at 5:42 a.m. saying her client meeting got moved up, and she needed to leave early, and the message had that too cheerful punctuation that made it feel like she was trying to sound casual, and I was still half asleep when I read it, but something in my body went alert like an animal hearing a twig snap. I watched her dot move, and at first it made sense, because it went toward downtown the way it would if she was going to her design firm, and I remember feeling briefly ashamed for even checking, like I was accusing her in my head without evidence, and then the dot took an exit it never took for her office, and it moved into a neighborhood I recognized because Matt used to live nearby before he moved in with Chloe, and my stomach did this slow sinking thing, like an elevator cable snapping but quietly, so you have time to understand what's happening. I tried to rationalize it in real time, because your brain will do anything to keep your world intact, and I thought maybe she was meeting a client who lived over there, or maybe she was stopping at a coffee shop, or maybe her GPS was glitching, but then the dot stopped, and it stayed stopped, and it stayed stopped long enough that I was fully awake and sitting upright in bed, and when I called her, it went straight to voicemail in a way that felt deliberate. I drove there without fully admitting to myself what I was doing, telling myself I was just going to confirm she was safe, or confirm her meeting was real, or confirm anything that didn't end with my marriage disintegrating, and I parked across the street like a creep and stared at the townhouse complex until my eyes ached, watching for her car like I was hunting my own life. When I saw her car in the visitor spot, I felt my whole body go cold, and I remember noticing absurd details, like how her rear window still had that faded beach parking sticker from last summer, and how one of the brake lights had condensation in it because I'd been meaning to replace it, and thinking, irrationally, that it was unfair that something so normal-looking could be parked in front of something so evil. I didn't storm in, because I'm not that brave, and I didn't want to risk being wrong, because if I was wrong I'd be the one who poisoned us, but I did something even worse for my dignity, because I waited and watched, and after about 15 minutes the front door opened and Matt stepped out in gym shorts and a hoodie like it was the most normal morning of his life, and he walked to Erin's car and leaned in through the driver's window, and the way he moved wasn't the way a friend moves around someone's wife, it was the way a man moves around a woman who belongs to a shared secret. Then Erin got out of the car, and she wasn't dressed for a client meeting, because she was dressed in that soft oversized sweater I bought her last Christmas, the one she used to wear at home, the one that always smelled like her shampoo and made me feel like she was mine when she curled up next to me on the couch, and she stepped into Matt's arms like she'd done it 100 times. That's the part that did the real damage, not the hug itself, but the ease of it, the practiced way her hands went to his shoulders, the way his hands settled at her waist like his body already knew the shape of her, and I sat there with my mouth open and my hands locked on the steering wheel like I was trying to hold myself together by force, because it wasn't just a betrayal in progress, it was a betrayal with history. I took a shaky photo through the windshield, because some part of me understood that if this got ugly later, I'd need proof, and the idea of needing proof against my wife and my best friend made me feel like I was going to throw up, but I did it anyway because shock can make you practical in horrifying ways. I confronted Erin that night, not because I had a plan, but because I didn't know how to breathe around her anymore, and the whole day I was at work pretending to troubleshoot network tickets while my brain replayed the scene in a loop like a torture device, and I kept feeling this alternating heat and numbness, like my nervous system couldn't decide whether to fight or shut down. When she walked in the front door around 6:30 p.m. She acted normal in that bright, too light way people act when they're hiding something heavy, and she kissed my cheek and said, "Hey babe," like she hadn't stood in my best friend's arms that morning, like she hadn't put on the sweater I gave her and turned it into a costume for someone else. I didn't scream right away, even though every part of me wanted to, because there's this surreal moment when you're staring at someone you love and you're realizing they've been living a second life, and you're trying to align the person in front of you with the person you thought you knew, and the mismatch makes you feel insane. I told her, very calmly at first, "Where were you this morning, Erin, and don't say work, because I know you weren't at work," and she froze in the entryway with her purse still on her shoulder, and I watched her face try to assemble a mask in real time, because she blinked like she needed to buy a second, and she gave me this careful smile like she was about to talk a customer out of a return. She said, "What is this, Jake? Why are you talking to me like that? I told you I had a client meeting," and I remember hearing my own laugh come out, sharp and ugly, because it didn't sound like me, and I said, "You want to try again, or do you want me to tell you what townhome complex you were at, and whose arms you were in, and what sweater you were wearing while you did it?" Her face went white so fast it was like a light switched off, and she dropped her purse on the floor with this soft thud that felt like punctuation, and she said my name in this trembling whisper, "Jake," like she was trying to pull me back from a cliff, and I felt my eyes burn, not because I wanted to cry but because my body was doing things without my permission. I told her I saw her with Matt, and I watched her swallow hard, and then she did the thing cheaters do when they're cornered, because she reached for the tiniest sliver of technical truth like it could save her, and she said, "It's not what you think," and I swear to God it took everything in me not to laugh again, because I didn't even know what I thought yet, not fully, because thinking it would make it real. I stepped closer, and I held up my phone, and I said, "This is what I think, Erin. I think my wife is sleeping with my best friend, and I think you've been doing it long enough that you don't even flinch when he touches you, so if you're about to tell me it was a mistake, you better understand how hard you're going to have to work to make that sound believable." She started crying immediately, but it wasn't the soft kind of crying that makes you want to comfort someone, it was frantic, desperate crying, like she was watching her own safety net burn, and she said, "Please don't do this, please don't make it ugly," and that line hit me like a slap because she wasn't asking me not to be hurt, she was asking me not to react, like my pain was an inconvenience to her mess. I asked her how long, and she shook her head and said she didn't know, which is always such a lie because you always know, and I said, "Tell me the truth or I'm done listening," and she choked out, "Since late August," and I felt something in me snap quietly, because late August wasn't a one-time mistake, late August was a season, a whole chunk of our life where she came home to me after being with him, where she sat at dinner with me and probably texted him under the table, where she let me believe we were struggling because of stress when really we were struggling because she had already left. Then she tried to justify it, because she said, "You've been so absent," and I remember staring at her like she'd started speaking another language, because I work long hours, sure, but I wasn't absent from our marriage, I was present in every way I knew how, and I said, "I wasn't absent, Erin, you were sneaking off to be with him, you were absent, and you don't get to rewrite that because it makes you feel better." She flinched at that, and then she did the other thing, the thing that hurts even worse than the lying, because she said, "It started as talking," like that made it less disgusting, like emotional betrayal is somehow a smaller crime, and she said Matt understood her, and he listened, and I wanted to scream because I listened to her for 10 years, and when she needed something different, she didn't talk to me about it. She went and found it in the one person who could destroy me twice as fast. When I asked if Chloe knew, Erin's eyes flicked away in this guilty, cowardly motion, and she whispered, "No," and I felt a fresh wave of anger, because it wasn't just that they cheated, it was that they cheated while letting Chloe smile at them at dinners, while letting Chloe bring Erin little gifts like candles and houseplants, while letting Chloe treat them like family. I told Erin to leave for the night, and she said, "Where am I supposed to go?" And I said, "I don't care, go to Matt, since that's where you already are," and she gasped like I'd stabbed her, like I was the cruel one, and she said, "Jake, please, we can talk, we can fix this," and I remember standing there with tears on my face, feeling like my whole chest was collapsing inward, and saying, "You didn't fix it when it mattered, Erin. You set it on fire and you let it burn for months." She tried to touch my arm, and I stepped back, and she started sobbing harder, and the last thing she said before she grabbed her overnight bag was, "If you tell anyone, you'll ruin everything," and that line was the moment I realized she still didn't understand what she'd done, because she was worried about consequences, not about the crater she left in me. After she left, the house felt too quiet in a way that made my skin itch, and I walked from room to room like I was checking for intruders even though the intruder had already been living with me, and I kept seeing her sweater folded on the couch and feeling this nausea that wasn't physical sickness so much as my brain rejecting reality. I went into the bathroom and stared at myself in the mirror, and I didn't recognize my face, because my eyes looked older and flatter, like something had drained out of them, and I remember thinking, with this weird bitter clarity, that I was going to be one of those guys whose friends say, he was never the same after that, and I hated that idea because I didn't want her to get to change me. I tried calling Matt, not because I thought he'd confess, but because I wanted to hear his voice and see if I could detect the lie in it, like maybe my childhood instincts would save me, and he didn't answer, and that made my anger turn into something sharper, because silence is an answer when you're guilty. I didn't sleep, and when morning came, it didn't feel like a new day, it felt like the same nightmare with different lighting, and I sat at the kitchen table with cold coffee and thought about every memory I had with Matt, every camping trip, every dumb joke, every time he told me he'd take a bullet for me, and I realized he wouldn't take a bullet for me, because he'd already put the gun in his own hand and aimed it at my life. By midday, sadness hit in a way that surprised me, because the anger was easier, the anger made me feel powerful, but sadness made me feel like a child who lost his home, and I kept thinking about Erin laughing with me on our honeymoon, Erin crying in my arms when her dad died, Erin whispering, "I'm so lucky," on our anniversary, and I couldn't reconcile those moments with the woman who hugged Matt like she belonged there. The worst part was the creeping self-doubt, because even though I knew cheating is a choice, I kept hearing her words in my head, "You've been absent," and I kept scanning my last year of life like a security camera, looking for the moment I failed, looking for the moment I created the opening, and I hated myself for doing that, because it felt like I was taking partial blame for a crime I didn't commit. That afternoon, my phone buzzed with a text from Chloe that said, "Hey, are you and Erin okay? Because Matt has been weird as hell and I don't like it," and I stared at it for a long time, because my first instinct was to protect Chloe from pain, and my second instinct was to tell her everything because she deserved the truth, and my third instinct was to do absolutely nothing because I didn't know who I was anymore. I typed, deleted, typed again, and finally I wrote, "Can you meet me somewhere private tonight, like not at our houses, and please don't tell Matt," and she responded almost immediately with, "What the hell is going on?" and I wrote back, "I can't explain in a text, but you need to hear it," and she sent, "Okay, I'm in, name the place," and even though I was shaking, I felt something shift, because I wasn't alone anymore, and neither was she, even if she didn't know it yet. That night, I chose a quiet place on purpose, this half-empty diner off Glenwood that serves breakfast all day and smells like coffee and fryer oil, because I didn't want a bar where emotions could turn loud, and I didn't want my house where Erin's absence would echo off every wall, and I didn't want Chloe at her place because I didn't want her to walk back into the life she thought she had without armor. When Chloe slid into the booth across from me, she looked tired, and she kept twisting the ring on her finger even though they weren't engaged, and she said, "Jake, you're scaring me, what is this?" and I took a breath that felt like swallowing glass, and I said, "I saw them this morning," and she blinked like she didn't understand the sentence, and I clarified, "I saw Erin with Matt, at a townhouse complex, and they hugged like they've been doing it for months," and Erin admitted it when I confronted her. Chloe's face changed in slow motion, like disbelief trying to hold the door shut while reality pushed in, and then she whispered, "No," over and over, not loud, just desperate, like if she said no enough times the universe would listen, and I watched her hands start to tremble, and I felt this sick empathy because I knew exactly what it felt like to have your world cut loose from under you. She asked me if I was sure, and I showed her the blurry photo I took through the windshield, and she stared at it until her eyes filled, and then she pushed the phone back like it burned her, and she covered her mouth with her hand and started crying in a way that made the waitress pause nearby like she didn't know whether to intervene. I leaned forward, and I said, quietly but firmly, "Chloe, listen to me, I'm not telling you this to hurt you, I'm telling you because you deserve the truth, and because if they've been doing this since August, then they've been lying to both of us every single day, and I don't think either of us should keep protecting them by staying quiet." Chloe wiped her face with her sleeve like she didn't care how she looked, and she whispered, "He swore on his mother," and I felt a grim, hollow laugh almost rise, because that's the kind of detail that makes betrayal feel extra cruel, the casual way they swear loyalty while actively destroying you. Then Chloe did something that made me sit back, because she looked straight at me with this fierce, shattered anger, and she said, "Okay, then we do this together," and I stared at her, and she added, "I'm not letting them spin some story where we're crazy, or where it was a mistake, or where we drove them to it, and I'm not going to be the last person to know the truth in my own life." I didn't call it revenge in my head, at least not yet, because revenge sounds petty and teenage, but what I felt was something colder and cleaner, because I wanted consequences, I wanted accountability, I wanted them to be forced to stand in the mess they made instead of skipping away into some shiny new relationship built on our ruin. So I nodded slowly, and I said, "Okay," and Chloe leaned forward, voice shaking but hard, and she said, "Then we gather everything, we make it undeniable, and we make sure they don't get to rewrite history," and as she said it, I realized the alliance was already formed, not out of cruelty, but out of survival, because when two people are betrayed by the same hands, the only way to stay sane is to lock arms and refuse to be gaslit alone. When I left that diner, the night air felt sharper, and my heart still hurt in that raw, bleeding way, but I also felt a strange clarity, because I finally understood that Erin didn't just betray me, she betrayed our entire history, the shared jokes, the anniversaries, the quiet promises, and Matt didn't just betray me, he betrayed the kid version of us who used to swear we'd always have each other's backs. I went home to an empty bed and I didn't sleep, but I wasn't spiraling the same way, because now there was a direction, and I hate admitting that because it makes me sound calculating, but direction is the only antidote to helplessness, and helplessness is what betrayal feeds on. And as I stared at the ceiling, listening to the house creak like it was grieving with me, I kept thinking about the way Erin warned me, "If you tell anyone, you'll ruin everything," and the truth settled into me like a stone, because everything was already ruined, and the only question left was whether the ruin would swallow me too, or whether I would turn it into something they couldn't escape. The next 2 weeks felt like living in a parallel version of my own life, because on the outside I still went to work, still answered emails, still nodded in meetings like I wasn't carrying a bomb in my ribs, while on the inside I was doing that obsessive post-betrayal math where you try to add up every lie and subtract every moment you thought was real until you're left with a number you can tolerate. Erin came back to the house the next day acting like she could negotiate her way out of the crater, and she kept switching between crying and anger like she was throwing emotional darts to see which one landed, and I kept noticing how she never once asked how I was doing, not really, because her questions were always about the situation, the optics, the logistics of damage control, and it made me feel like I'd married someone who saw me as a piece of furniture, something useful to her life. Until it wasn't. Matt, meanwhile, texted me the kind of long apology message that reads like a press release, full of phrases like, "I never meant to hurt you," and, "It just happened," and, "We got caught up," and Chloe and I sat together at her apartment reading it line by line like we were analyzing a scam email, because none of it was real accountability, it was just a man trying to slip his guilt into my hands so he could feel lighter. Chloe took it even harder than I expected, not because she loved Matt more than I loved Erin, but because Chloe had been the one publicly defending him, the one telling her friends he was different, the one posting pictures of them on trips, the one planning this slow, steady future, and betrayal doesn't just break your heart, it breaks your sense of judgment, because you start wondering whether you're a fool by nature. There were nights Chloe and I just sat there in silence on her couch with some dumb reality show playing, not because we cared, but because the noise helped keep our brains from screaming, and there were moments where she would suddenly start shaking and saying, "I let him touch me after he touched her," and I would feel that same sickness because I'd kissed Erin goodbye after she'd been with him, and we kept reminding each other that they did the dirty work. Not us, but reminders only go so far when your body feels contaminated by someone else's choices. Chloe was the first one to say the sentence out loud, and it still rings in my ears because of how calm she sounded when she said it, like she'd passed through the fire and found something solid on the other side, because she looked at me and said, "We don't do anything illegal, we don't do anything that makes us the story, but we do make sure the truth lands where it needs to land." So that became the rule, the spine of the plan, because neither of us wanted to be the person who slashes tires or shows up screaming at workplaces, not because they wouldn't deserve some chaos, but because that kind of chaos comes back on you, and I didn't want to hand Erin a narrative where she could tell people, "Jake went crazy," and paint herself as the frightened victim instead of the person who lit the match. Chloe had screenshots, because Matt had gotten sloppy with his phone, and she had months of weirdly intimate messages between him and Aaron where they talked about timing and being careful and Jake can't know yet, and she sent them to me in a folder, and I remember staring at lines of text that used my name like a piece on a chessboard, and feeling my anger settle into something clear, because you can't argue with evidence, and evidence is the enemy of gaslighting. I met with a divorce attorney 3 days after the confrontation, and I didn't tell Aaron I was going, because I wasn't asking permission, and the lawyer's office smelled like stale coffee and toner, and she spoke in that careful, professional tone people use when they've seen 1,000 broken marriages, and she told me, gently but plainly, that the smartest thing I could do was document everything, keep communication in writing, and make decisions from strategy rather than emotion. Chloe did the same, because she wasn't married to Matt but they lived together and had joint expenses, and she wanted to make sure she wouldn't get financially wrecked by a man who had already proven he could lie with a straight face. Then we did the hard part, the part that feels petty until you remember its protection, because Chloe and I compared timelines and built a clean, factual record, not for gossip, not for humiliation, but for the moment when Aaron and Matt inevitably tried to rewrite the story, because cheaters always try to rewrite the story, and they'll say it was one mistake, or they'll say it was a misunderstanding, or they'll say you were cruel and distant, and if you don't have receipts, you end up defending yourself against lies you never deserved. Chloe suggested something that at first made me recoil because it sounded dramatic, but then I realized it was necessary, because she said, we confront them at the same time, separate places, same hour, and we make sure they can't coordinate their lies, and I thought about Aaron and Matt huddling up like teammates, crafting a story that made them look romantic instead of rotten, and I knew Chloe was right. We picked a Friday, because Aaron had a work event that evening, and Matt was supposed to meet friends at a brewery, and Chloe and I agreed that we'd do it before they left, when they were still in their normal routines, when they couldn't run away and hide behind public crowds, and when the shock would land like it needed to land. The night before, Erin tried one last time to pull me back into the fog, because she sat at the kitchen table and cried and told me she loved me and told me she didn't know how it happened, and I listened, and part of me wanted to be the old version of myself who comforted her, but then she said, please don't tell Chloe, she'll hate me, and that was the moment I realized Erin wasn't sorry for what she did. She was sorry for what it might cost her, because she still cared more about how she was seen than about what she'd broken. I told her, calmly, you should have thought about that before you did it, and Erin's face hardened, and she snapped, so you're really going to destroy me, and I remember thinking, in this almost peaceful way, that she still didn't understand the difference between consequences and cruelty, and she said, Matt loves me, like it was a weapon, and I felt the last thread of tenderness inside me go limp, because if she needed to believe their affair was love to survive it, I wasn't going to donate my dignity to support her delusion. At 4 p.m. on Friday, Chloe went to her apartment, and I stayed at my house, and we were on the phone with each other like two people about to walk into surgery without anesthesia, because we kept checking in, you ready, you safe, remember, calm, because the plan depended on steadiness. Chloe confronted Matt first, because he got home earlier, and I could hear her voice through the phone, not loud, not hysterical, but razor sharp, as she said, open your phone and don't lie to me, because I already know, and Matt did what guilty people do, because he tried to laugh, tried to play dumb, and then the moment she mentioned Erin by name his voice cracked into this defensive rage that sounded like a cornered animal. He started with, this is between me and Jake, which was almost funny if it wasn't so evil, because he was acting like he had some ownership over my life, and Chloe shot back, no, you don't get to put my name outside the circle while you sleep with someone else's wife behind my back, and then she told him she had screenshots, and I heard the exact moment his confidence died, because his tone shifted into pleading, and he started saying he never meant for it to happen, and he loved Chloe. And it didn't mean anything, and Chloe said, with this cold clarity that made my stomach twist, if it didn't mean anything, you wouldn't have risked everything for it. At 4:30, I confronted Erin, and I didn't do it with screaming, because screaming would have been giving her the emotional chaos she could later use as a shield, so I sat her down and told her, I filed, and she stared at me like she couldn't process the words, and then she lunged into bargaining, promising counseling, promising transparency, promising anything she thought would restore her control. I told her, it's over, and Erin's eyes turned into something angry and bright, and she said, "So you're choosing to throw away 10 years, and I said, "No, Erin, you threw it away in August, I'm just cleaning up what you left in the street." When she realized I wasn't budging, she tried a different tactic, because she said, "Matt and I are real," and she said it like she wanted it to hurt, like she wanted me to picture them living happily while I sat alone, and I watched her face like I was watching a stranger, and I said, "If he's real, then you should be excited that Chloe knows, because real love doesn't have to hide," and Erin's mouth opened and closed, because she understood immediately what I meant, and her eyes darted to her phone like she was about to call Matt to warn him. I held my hand out and said, "Give me your phone," and she said, "You can't take my phone," and I said, "I'm not stealing it, Erin, I'm keeping you from sabotaging what you set in motion," and the rage on her face was almost comical, because she finally saw that her ability to manage the narrative was gone. Chloe texted me one word at 4:52 p.m. Done, and I felt my heart pound like it was trying to escape my chest, because that was the moment the alliance stopped being a plan and became a reality. Here's the part that people always want to be cinematic, and it wasn't, because there was no slow clap, no triumphant music, no instant karmic lightning bolt, just two guilty people scrambling to protect themselves, and two betrayed people refusing to carry their shame for them anymore. Matt showed up at my house around 6 p.m. Uninvited, red-faced and sweating, and he pounded on my door like he still had access to my life, and when I opened it, he launched into this desperate, furious monologue about how Chloe was overreacting, and how Erin and I weren't happy anyway, and how he fell for her, and the whole thing was so selfish and delusional that I felt something shift from anger into disgust, because he wasn't sorry, he was inconvenienced. I told him, very plainly, "Get off my porch," and Matt stepped closer like he wanted to intimidate me the way he used to intimidate guys in high school, and I stared right back and said, "You don't get to act like a brother after you stabbed me like an enemy," and I watched his eyes flicker, because that line landed where it hurt, and he tried to say, "We can fix this," and I said, "You can't fix character, Matt, and that's what this is." Erin tried to rally her friends first, because she started texting people half-truths about how I was cold and withholding and punishing her, but Chloe had already told her closest friends the truth with screenshots, and when Erin tried to show up at a girls' brunch like nothing happened, she got confronted with reality instead of sympathy, because no one likes being lied to, and Erin had been lying to everyone, not just me. At work, Erin's behavior started unraveling, because once your personal life explodes, you don't always get to keep the polished professional mask, and she missed deadlines and snapped at coworkers, and people who used to love her suddenly saw the sharpness underneath, and her boss pulled her aside, not because of the affair itself, but because Erin was spiraling, and spiraling has a way of making you careless. Matt's consequences were uglier, because Chloe kicked him out, and he had nowhere to go except the same townhome complex where he and Erin thought they were playing house in secret, and when he leaned on Erin for comfort, Erin discovered what Chloe and I already knew, which was that relationships built on betrayal are held together by fantasy, and fantasy collapses fast when it has to pay rent. Erin called me late one night, voice slurred like she'd been drinking, and she said, "He's not who I thought," and I sat there in the dark holding my phone, listening to the woman who broke me try to recruit me as her emotional safety net again, and I said, softly but firmly, "I can't be that for you anymore," and Erin started sobbing, and she said, "So I ruined everything," and I said, "Yes, you did, because sometimes the truth is the only mercy left." The divorce wasn't quick, because divorces never are when emotions are hot, and Erin fought for things she didn't even seem to want just to feel like she wasn't losing, and I watched her spend money on legal battles while her career momentum stalled, and while her friendships frayed, and while her relationship with Matt turned into this exhausted tug-of-war between two people trying to convince themselves they hadn't destroyed their lives for nothing. Matt and Erin tried to make it official for a while, because they needed the affair to become a love story to justify the wreckage, but the problem with that is that love stories don't begin with two people lying to everyone who trusted them, and once the secrecy was gone, the thrill died, and what was left was two selfish people staring at each other and realizing the other wasn't a prize, they were a mirror. Chloe moved out of state about 6 months later for a promotion she'd been putting off because she'd been building a life around Matt, and the day she left, she hugged me in the parking lot of a U-Haul place and said, "We didn't deserve this," and I said, "No, we didn't," and we stood there for a long moment like two survivors acknowledging a shared disaster, and then she got in her truck and drove away, and I felt proud of her in this bittersweet way, because she chose herself instead of staying stuck in the wreckage. As for me, I rebuilt quietly, not with dramatic revenge, but with steady choices, because I got therapy. I started running again even though I hated it. I reconnected with friends I'd neglected during the marriage, and over time I stopped checking Erin's social media, stopped letting her decisions take up free rent in my brain, and that's the real win nobody talks about, because the happiest ending isn't someone else suffering, it's you being able to breathe again. Erin's life didn't fall apart in one big explosion, it fell apart in a slow chain of consequences, because her reputation changed, her friendships thinned, her job stability shook, her relationship with Matt collapsed, and when she finally tried to come back toward the life she'd had, she found the door closed, not because I was cruel, but because trust isn't a revolving door you can keep walking through after you've set it on fire. The last time I saw her in person was at a courthouse hallway signing final paperwork, and she looked smaller somehow, not physically, but emotionally, like her own choices had hollowed her out, and she tried to meet my eyes and said, "I hope you're happy," in that bitter tone people use when they want happiness to sound like a crime, and I looked at her and said, "I am," because I refused to pretend otherwise for her comfort. What I learned is something I wish I didn't have to learn, because it cost too much, but it's simple, and it's this: betrayal doesn't start in a bedroom, it starts in the tiny choices people make when they decide their feelings matter more than their integrity, and by the time you catch the big lie, the small lies have already become a habit. If you're reading this and you're in the early stage, where your gut is whispering and you're telling yourself you're paranoid, I'm not saying you should become a detective, but I am saying you should stop ignoring yourself, because denial is how people stay trapped, and truth, even when it destroys you, is how you eventually get free. And if you ever find yourself on the betrayed side, feeling that primal urge to burn everything down, my advice is this: don't give them the gift of making you the villain, don't do anything that lets them point at your reaction and use it to distract from their choices, because the cleanest sentence you can hand a betrayer is reality, delivered calmly, documented clearly, and followed by the one thing they never expected, which is you walking away and building a life that doesn't include them at all.